The morning was quiet. Suburban Illinois sunlight draped itself across still lawns, catching on parked cars and glass mailboxes. Inside one home, the hum of an air conditioner filled the small kitchen. A half-drunk cup of tea sat on the counter. At 11:30 a.m., someone knocked. That sound, soft, steady, broke the rhythm of an ordinary day. When the door opened, fear entered quietly, already shaped like a man. Within minutes, the floor would be slick, a child would be gone, and a woman would crawl through the fragments of her life to call for help. This wasn't the kind of crime that built legends. It was smaller, a single, senseless eruption in a neighborhood built to avoid them. And yet, that house in Plainfield would become a marker, a place where a sentence spoken softly, "Let's give peace a chance," would echo against silence. His name was Joseph Chuba, 71 years old, retired and restless. He owned the house next door, and with it a small sense of control over who lived there. His tenant was 32-year-old Hanan Shaheen, a Palestinian-American mother with a calm voice and a son who still left his toys out by the door. That week, Chuba's world had narrowed to the noise coming from his radio, political talk shows, angry callers, words like terror, invasion, day of jihad. The line between fear and obsession thinned by the hour. On October 14th, 2023, he crossed the patch of grass separating their homes. A knife with a black handle sat inside his jacket pocket. He told his wife earlier that morning he was prepared. She hadn't asked for what. When Hanan Shaheen opened the door, his first words weren't coherent, a blur of accusation, something about Jerusalem, about Muslims, about safety. She tried to calm him. "Let's give peace a chance," she said, the phrase she always used when fear entered conversation. But he wasn't listening. His hand found her throat. Her back hit the wall. She clawed at him, pushing against the weight of age and rage. He drew the knife. The sound it made against skin was almost domestic, the tearing of fabric. She stumbled into the bathroom, dialing 911. When she emerged, there was only stillness. Her son, 6-year-old Wadea al-Fayoume, lay on the hallway floor, 10 stab wounds, his eyes half open as if watching something far away. The clock on the wall had stopped at 11:42. Outside, Chuba sat on the curb. Blood streaked his face. His expression was not panic, not guilt, only blankness, like a man who had finally acted out a thought he mistook for truth. The officers who arrived first were young. Their report would later describe the scene as contained. That was the word used when horror fits inside 4 walls. The Will County Sheriff's Office sealed the house. Evidence markers bloomed across the carpet like small yellow flowers. The knife lay near the door, its handle still damp. Shaheen was taken to the hospital in critical condition. Wadea's body followed, smaller, covered in a white sheet that seemed too heavy for someone so light. When detectives questioned Chuba's wife, her story came out in fragments. He had been obsessed with talk radio, terrified that the conflict in Gaza would come here. He believed the mother and son next door were somehow connected, a delusion shaped by static and fear. He'd withdrawn $1,000 from the bank in case the grid went down. He told her they might have to defend themselves. By the next morning, federal investigators had joined the case. The Attorney General called it a hate crime. The FBI opened a parallel file. Same conclusion. The motive was clear. Islamophobia, sharpened by paranoia, amplified by propaganda. In the following days, the local news repeated the same headline: hate crime in Plainfield. But the facts remained simple. An old man believed a lie long enough for it to kill a child. When officers escorted him from the scene, he didn't resist. His hands were steady, his eyes empty. Inside the patrol car, he asked one question. Did they call their friends? The officer didn't answer. In the weeks that followed, psychologists studying the case described Chuba's behavior as cognitive distortion reinforced by fear media. But the truth was plainer. His world had shrunk until only his fear fit inside it. Each radio segment fed the illusion that danger was everywhere. He began locking doors in the middle of the day, drawing curtains before sunset. His wife said he would mutter about them coming, the phrase repeating like a prayer. Shahin and her son were never threats. They were tenants who paid rent on time, smiled in passing, waved when the trash was collected. Yet in his mind, they became symbols, a narrative handed to him by voices that sounded like authority. He stopped speaking to neighbors. He stopped sleeping. The fear crystallized into certainty, and certainty gave him purpose. When he walked across the lawn that October morning, he wasn't thinking of crime or consequence. He was thinking of defense, of cleansing what he believed was danger. After the attack, when the sirens filled the street, he didn't run. He didn't hide. He simply sat. Later, in interrogation, when asked why he did it, he paused for a long time and said, "Because no one else would." The detective wrote the words down, slowly. The trial began 16 months later, February 24, 2025. Snow clung to the courthouse steps in Will County, gray at the edges where boots had passed. Inside, the hall smelled faintly of disinfectant and paper. People whispered in low voices, as if the building itself demanded restraint. Joseph Chuba entered in a beige prison uniform, hands cuffed, eyes fixed somewhere between the floor and memory. His lawyer spoke for him. His silence was complete. The jury selection lasted only a few hours. Everyone already knew the outlines of what had happened. The prosecution opened with the recording of Hanan Shahin's 911 call. Her voice, calm and terrified, bled through the speakers. The courtroom froze. Then came the evidence, the knife holder, the photographs, the police body camera footage showing the motionless child on the floor. A firefighter testified about finding Shahin conscious, whispering her son's name again and again. A physician's assistant described the wounds with the precision of someone who must. Chuba's wife took the stand. She said he had stopped sleeping, started talking about enemies, about grids collapsing and God testing him. Her hands shook when she said she had stopped recognizing her own husband. The defense called no witnesses. They argued mental confusion, stress, media influence. But the words couldn't soften what had been done. On February 28th, the jury took less than 90 minutes. The foreman's voice didn't waver. Guilty on all counts. The courtroom exhaled, a sound between relief and exhaustion. On May 2nd, the sentence arrived. 53 years. 30 for the boy, 20 for the mother, 3 for hate itself. In prison, he grew smaller. The cancer advanced, stage 4 by summer. When he died on July 24, 2025, there was no public notice, only a line in a file. No obituary, no flowers. A man who once believed he was defending something vanished quietly into the same silence he created. Outside that silence, life tried to rebuild. A week after the murder, a basketball court filled with candles. It was where Wadea had played most evenings, chasing the ball with that unbroken energy children have before the world introduces fear. People came carrying flowers, flags, handwritten notes. His father spoke first, calling him an all-American boy who loved to laugh. The phrase echoed softly through the crowd, folding into the hum of grief. The highest-ranking Muslim in the U.S. administration, Dilawar Syed, attended on behalf of the president. He didn't speak long, only said that a nation cannot claim peace while its citizens die for what they believe. Cameras flashed briefly, but the vigil itself was quiet, not a protest, not a spectacle, just people standing still in the cold. The funeral followed days later. A small coffin, too light for the weight it carried. The air smelled of incense and frost. Mothers held their children tighter. Men stood with their hands crossed, eyes lowered. The kind of mourning that leaves no sound. A fundraiser began on Launch Good, gathering thousands, enough to cover medical bills, burial, and a new start for Shaheen. A portion went toward a charity in the boy's name, an idea born from the same sentence he had heard his mother say before the attack: peace. By June of the following year, the town named a local playground after him. Bright plastic slides, new fences, a plaque in bronze, in loving memory of Wadea, a smile that belonged to everyone. On the day of the dedication, children played around it as speeches were made. Their laughter sounded out of place and perfect at once. Hanan Shaheen attended, a scarf around her neck to hide the scar. She didn't speak. She only stood beside the plaque, touching it once before walking away. Time kept moving, but under the surface, something else remained, a quiet fracture. Muslim families in Illinois began changing routines. Some canceled trips, avoided gatherings. They lowered their voices in public spaces. One man told a reporter, "You start to wonder which neighbor listens to which radio station." Across the country, security increased at mosques and synagogues alike. Two communities, both fearing mirrors of hate, both building higher fences. The politicians called it tragedy. The newspapers called it hate. The television called it news. But none of those words stayed long enough to hold meaning. What endured was smaller, the unrecorded moments, the stillness after sirens, the child's toys still lined against the wall, the faint smell of detergent when the officers first entered the house. The clock stopped at 11:42. Years later, when new tenants moved in, the property records no longer mentioned the crime. The paint covered what memory could not. And yet neighbors said on certain afternoons, when the sun struck the porch just right, the air felt heavier, as if grief had soaked into the wood itself. In the archives, the official documentation ends neatly. Defendant deceased, case closed. But crimes like this don't close. They diffuse into talk shows, into dinner tables, into the way people look at each other across fences. They remind the world how easily a thought can become a weapon when repeated enough times. For investigators, the lesson was procedural. For the public, political. But for those who lived through it, for the mother who survived, it was something else. Proof that kindness can be fatal in a frightened world. Sometimes she still speaks of her son, not as a victim, but as presence. The light she feels in rooms too quiet. And when asked what she remembers most from that morning, she doesn't mention the knife, or the shouting, or even the silence after. She mentions his eyes, the way they looked up at her one last time, as if waiting for the world to make sense. No one can tell her it ever did. The Plainfield case faded from the headlines as all stories do. But somewhere, archived deep in the folds of the internet, his name remains, a line of text under the tag Hate Crime 2023. The internet moves on. The fear remains. Sometimes late at night, when the town is still, a few remember the small boy who said nothing and the mother who said peace. And if you stand near that playground named after him, you can still hear echoes, the laughter of children, the creak of swings, the low murmur of traffic passing by. A reminder that peace isn't loud. It never has been. It's spoken softly, right before the door opens. It was a Monday morning, February 26 of 2024. The frost had thickened overnight across Crawford County, laying a faint silver film on fences and on the slow-turning wheels of passing buggies. In Spartan Township, Pennsylvania, air carried the dry quiet only found where machines do not hum and clocks do not dictate time. The Byler home stood a little apart from the road, 2 stories of plain timber, unpainted, unadorned. No electric light, no sound of radio, only the long whistle of the wind through the eaves. Inside, everything was arranged with deliberate simplicity. Chairs evenly spaced, the Bible at the center table, lanterns hanging from hooks that had darkened with years of handling. At 7 a.m., Andy Byler rose before the sun, hitching his horse to the small buggy that waited near the barn. He was meeting a neighbor to collect lumber from a distant property. His wife, Rebekah, stirred quietly as he dressed. She was 23 and 6 months pregnant. Her face was the kind of calm that came from habit, the practiced serenity of someone who lived without mirrors. 2 small children, still half dreaming, moved beneath wool blankets as their father kissed them goodbye. Rebekah poured oats into a tin bowl and left it near the stove to warm once the fire caught. The door closed softly behind him. Outside, hoofbeats faded until the only sound left was the wooden rhythm of her steps across the floorboards. She began her day the same way she always had. Laundry first, water drawn from the pump, steam fogging the windows. Then bread dough pressed and folded with steady hands. The world around her was a collection of small responsibilities. Life in the Amish community of Spartansburg moved through repetition: prayer, work, rest. There was peace in that predictability, and because of it, no one in the valley locked their doors. At 10:30 a.m., a wagon passed on the main road, its driver later remembering the sight of smoke rising from the Byler chimney, a thin grey column against white sky. It was ordinary, unremarkable. No one saw who came up the dirt lane an hour later. When Andy returned close to midday, the sky had brightened, but the cold still clung to the air. The lane showed faint tire marks, unusual for a horse-drawn household. The dog was silent. Something about the stillness pressed against him as he stepped onto the porch. He pushed the front door open and called, "Becky." The house answered with the sound of the rocking chair moving slightly, not from wind, but from weight recently shifted. His boots brushed against something sticky near the threshold. At first he thought it was mud. Then he saw the color. The room carried the heavy sweetness of iron, a smell that clings to air, to hair, to memory. Rebekah lay beside the chair she used to read by. One arm was folded unnaturally beneath her. The kerosene lamp on the nearby table had cracked, leaking a thin trail across the wood. He knelt beside her, but could not bring himself to touch the skin. It was already cold, and colder still was the understanding that she had been alone when it happened. In the adjoining room, the 2 children sat together near the toy chest. They were silent, as if instructed by something older than words. The neighbor who had driven with him that morning ran to the nearest phone 3 miles away to call 911. Andy stayed seated on the floor. He did not cry, not then. The quiet around him would not allow it. When the first responders arrived, they found no signs of forced entry. The kitchen door latch was undone, not broken. The windows were intact, the curtains drawn. A Bible lay open on the counter, a line underlined faintly in pencil. "He shall cover thee with his feathers, and under his wings shalt thou trust." The floor beneath the rocker showed 2 sets of prints, bare feet and another faint tread, patterned like sneakers. That detail stayed with one deputy for months. The idea of a modern soul pressed into a world that refused modernity. Rebekah's body bore 2 injuries, a deep cut to the neck and a gunshot wound to the head. The first suggested closeness, the second, certainty. Her right hand was bruised around the knuckles, a small final resistance. Investigators moved carefully, aware of the family's faith and the community's customs. They covered mirrors, avoided cameras. Even the coroner waited until sunset to remove her, as though intruding on the rhythm of an older piece. Outside, neighbors began to gather by the fence line. Word travels differently where there are no phones. A rider passes, another repeats, and within hours, 30 people stood in coats and hats, eyes fixed on the doorway, but not crossing it. Among the Amish, tragedy is met not with questions but with work, silent coordination, quiet tasks. Someone brought food, someone lit the lanterns for nightfall. The children were taken to another house, away from the noise of the radios and the flash of camera bulbs that would soon arrive from the outside world. That night, the scene was sealed. A sheriff's car remained parked under the maple tree, its lights off. Inside, technicians used powder on the doorframe and lifted partial fingerprints from a smooth surface, likely a handgun slide. No murder weapon was found. A single brass casing lay near the hearth. On it, a small smudge of soot formed the shape of a crescent. To the detectives, it meant little then, but later it would become the anchor in a chain of proof. The next morning, investigators reconstructed the hours leading to her death. Neighbors placed Andy and his companion miles away, corroborated by timestamps from a sawmill order. Rebekah had last been seen alive around 9:45 a.m. by a passing neighbor's wife who waved as she hung laundry outside. By 11:30, she was gone. No vehicles were reported on the lane, but someone recalled hearing a faint motor, an odd sound among the rhythmic clop of horses. A deputy found faint tread marks half hidden in the slush. They were narrow, from a compact truck or crossover. 8 miles away, in Corry, Pennsylvania, a man named Sean Cranston would later park his silver SUV behind his house, scraping the mud from his tires before dawn. Forensic teams worked methodically inside the home. They measured the distance from the entryway to the body, 7 paces. They noted the angle of light through the curtained window, how it caught on the brass handle of a cabinet. They marked blood spatter on the lower wall, not high enough to suggest a standing shot, which meant she was likely kneeling or seated when it happened. There were no footprints leading away from her body, only that single set leading in, and another partial by the back door, turned outward. Each observation was written in longhand on ruled paper. Cameras were rarely used out of respect for Amish restrictions. The case file would later contain more handwriting than photographs, a peculiarity that gave it a human pulse even within bureaucracy. By late afternoon, the coroner's van left the property. Snow began again, light flakes that erased every trace of the day. Reporters waited near the main road, asking questions no one would answer. The sheriff simply said, "We have a homicide. The children are safe." He did not say that one of those children had already spoken a sentence that chilled every investigator. He wore sneakers. Those words redirected the search. Among Amish men, boots and plain shoes were the rule. Sneakers meant the outsider. It was the smallest detail, and the only one. That night, the community gathered for prayer. Dozens of candles burned along the windows of neighboring homes, their reflections flickering against the dark fields. Inside the Byler house, silence hung thicker than before. The clock on the wall remained stopped at 11:42. Whether from damage or chance, no one wound it again. As dawn broke over Sparta Township on February 27th, the investigation began in earnest. State police units from Meadville arrived with forensic kits, maps, and quiet determination. The first detective stepped into the living room and wrote one observation in his notebook: "The house is silent, but not peaceful." Outside, snow fell without sound. The tire tracks were gone. Only memory remained, and a faint outline of a world that had never been prepared for this kind of violence. The investigation began in the cold hour before sunrise. Troopers moved through the Byler property like slow ghosts, boots sinking in snow that remembered nothing. Each print they made would melt by noon, taking the order of the morning with it. They mapped the scene first. Distances, angles, temperatures. In crime scenes, numbers become the only language left to trust. 11 feet from door to body, 2 visible wounds, 1 spent casing. But what unsettled investigators most was what they couldn't find. No fingerprints on the latch, no broken glass, no footprints leading away. A sergeant examined the small handprint left on the floor near her body, the child's. He paused before writing it down. There is something unnatural about seeing innocence recorded as evidence. Within 24 hours, the quiet township was surrounded by the noise of a modern investigation. Aerial drones scanned the farmland. Dogs traced faint scent lines that stopped abruptly near the property's edge. The conclusion was simple and chilling. Whoever came here had known the place, had driven close enough to know when Andy left, had entered quickly, and had left without haste. Detectives canvassed the nearby roads, knocking on doors of Amish and English neighbors alike. Most offered warm hands, cold stares, and few words. The Amish community is not unkind, it is simply protective. They feared intrusion, feared that the outside world would use their tragedy for spectacle. Still, one witness remembered a vehicle, silver or grey, parked near the tree line around mid-morning. Another recalled hearing a single loud crack echoing across the field. At first, they assumed it was a hunter. No one reported it. In places this rural, silence is not suspicious. The clue that changed everything came from the smallest voice. During a quiet interview, the 3-year-old son repeated the same phrase. The man had sneakers. Detectives asked what color. He said, "White." He pointed to his own small leather shoes that touched the floor. Then he added something unexpected. That detail was entered into the case file without comment. It didn't narrow much, only widened the possibility of an outsider. For weeks, investigators cross-checked shoe prints from nearby businesses. They found nothing. But 8 miles away, in the small town of Corry, Pennsylvania, a neighbor filed a separate complaint. A man named Sean Cranston had been acting strangely, cleaning his car in the middle of the night, burning old clothing in a steel drum behind his home. When detectives arrived at his residence on March 1st, they noticed the sneakers drying near his porch, a white pair, faint reddish stain along the outer sole. Cranston claimed it was rust. They took them anyway. The search of his home began before dawn. They found 6 firearms, ammunition, and a jacket with threads matching fibers from the Byler home. Cranston was arrested quietly, without resistance. The report describes him as alert but detached, as if the words themselves meant nothing. He was charged with 2 counts of homicide, one for Rebekah, one for her unborn child, along with burglary and trespass. His mugshot spread through local news outlets like a wound in the calm of Amish country. The face of the intruder had entered their world. At first, the community did not speak his name. The Ordnung, their code of conduct, discourages judgment, even against the guilty. But behind closed doors, among lantern light and prayer, fear crept in like cold air through cracked wood. They had lived believing the outside world would pass them by. Now it had found them, and it had spoken violence. As the trial approached, fragments of the killer's life surfaced. A 52-year-old from Corey, former truck driver, quiet neighbor, sometimes kind, sometimes withdrawn. He had no connection to the Bylers, no motive anyone could name. The lack of reason made it worse. Crimes of passion can be understood, crimes of nothing cannot. Psychologists later described Cranston's affect as flat. No tremor, no visible anger, no defense. When asked why he did it, he looked down and said, "I don't remember." But memory is rarely kind enough to disappear completely. Investigators found his internet searches, local Amish maps, property locations, and phrases about isolated homes. It painted a portrait not of madness, but of method, curiosity that crossed into fixation. Forensic tests confirmed the blood on the sneakers matched Rebekah's DNA. Gun residue linked to the same model seized from his home. The evidence built itself like slow frost, layer by layer, until it could no longer be ignored. By June 2025, the courthouse in Crawford County filled each day with people who had never before set foot inside one. Plain coats, dark bonnets, buggies parked beside patrol cars. The outside world pressed its cameras to the glass while the community faced forward, silent. Inside, the prosecution moved with quiet precision. Witnesses described the discovery, the footprints, the evidence. When Rebekah's husband was called to testify, the room shifted, air thickening with something no legal proceeding could contain. He spoke little. He only said, "She was good." Then he looked toward Cranston once, not in hatred, but in recognition, that somewhere, something had gone irreparably wrong between two forms of humanity. The jury deliberated less than 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict came in 4 words: guilty on all counts. 2 life sentences, no parole, no relief. Outside, the sky was overcast, and yet it felt brighter than it should have. Reporters spoke into cameras. The Amish loaded their carriages and left quietly, as if the event itself were too heavy to look back at. Time moved on, as it always does, without permission. Months after the sentencing, the Byler house remained empty. Windows boarded, barn silent. Grass grew where tire tracks once led to tragedy. The clock inside still hung on the wall, frozen at 11:42. Neighbors spoke less about the crime and more about the idea of it, that evil can find its way even into lives defined by peace. They wondered what Rebekah might have said in her final seconds, whether she prayed, whether she looked at him and saw a man or only the end. No one could answer. Her husband and children moved to another district, away from reporters, away from memory. Community members built a new home for them, paid for by donations from strangers who would never meet them. Some wrote letters, some sent prayers. In every gesture, there was both kindness and futility, as if the world was trying to apologize for something it could not prevent. Years from now, the name Rebekah Byler will remain in court records, on news archives, and in the quiet recollection of a town that lost its innocence for good. But among the Amish, memory is not kept in ink. It is carried in silence, in the unspoken space between dawn chores and evening prayers. Sometimes in Sparta Township, visitors say the house feels colder than the air around it. Not haunted, just paused, like a breath that never finished leaving the body of a moment. In every community that prides itself on simplicity, there exists the same fragile belief that goodness protects itself. Rebekah's death reminded them that even the simplest lives can be chosen by chaos. There is no pattern, no fairness, only the soft rhythm of time continuing, indifferent. The official reports closed, the trial concluded, the headlines faded. But in that plain wooden home, a lantern still hangs by the door. It was never lit again. It began in the kind of silence that carries weight. Not the natural pause of night, but the waiting quiet before discovery. The kind of stillness that hums through walls and makes the refrigerator sound like breathing. In a sixth-floor apartment in Highbridge, Bronx, the air had turned heavy and chemical. It smelled of bleach, of something covered, of a coldness that did not belong to the season. Inside that apartment, under fluorescent light that never flickered, a blue plastic bin stood beside a freezer. Its lid did not fit tightly anymore. The floor was wet. There were faint drag marks leading from the living room to the kitchen, fading as if time itself wanted to hide the path. Down below, New York City moved on, traffic lights changing for no one, windows glowing against the damp air. Somewhere inside that stillness lay the body of Collin Small, a 44-year-old man who had spent most of his life learning how to start over. And standing only a few feet away was Sheldon Johnson Jr., a man who had once been a reformed criminal, a man who had spoken about redemption on national stages. The clock on the wall showed 1:10 a.m. when the first shot was fired. Two sounds broke the night. Then a voice, cracked, human, terrified. "Please don't, I have a family." The final shot came seconds later. After that, the building went back to breathing. The next morning, the hallway smelt of detergent and something else no one could name. The superintendent, used to noise, noticed the strange rhythm of silence. At 10 a.m., he replayed the security footage. Collin had come home at 10 p.m., walking slowly, keys in his hand, no sign of fear. The door closed behind him. Hours later, another man appeared. Same hallway, same camera, different presence. Sheldon Johnson. He entered with a calm stride, dressed in dark clothes, carrying nothing. The video became a quiet record of unraveling. Johnson left the apartment at 1:20 a.m., changed his clothes, returned wearing a hat. Then again, later, a blonde wig. Each time he came back, something else appeared. Gloves, a mop, a roll of blue plastic. At 3 a.m., he dragged a bin into the room, the kind used for storage or disposal. The corridor lights caught the gleam of metal near his wrist. No one stopped him. No one asked. At 11:30 a.m., a tenant called the superintendent, reporting that she had heard bangs during the night, maybe 4, maybe 5. She had heard the voice of a man begging. The superintendent dialed 911, his tone neutral, procedural. The call was logged for a wellness check. It was 8:25 p.m. when 2 NYPD officers finally arrived at apartment 6D. Johnson opened the door himself. He wore fresh clothes, a calm face, and eyes that didn't seem to belong to anyone present. The air behind him was wrong, thick and cold. When they asked about Collin Small, Johnson said he went upstate. Inside, the freezer buzzed under the fluorescent light. One of the officers opened it. A faint mist rose, carrying the metallic scent of something irreversible. Wrapped inside plastic and frozen solid were the remains of a human torso. Nearby, in a blue bin, feet. The clock on the counter had stopped at 1:17 a.m., as if the apartment had kept its own record of time of death. The evidence came slowly. Cleaning fluids, duct tape, a Tyvek suit, concrete mix in Johnson's car. Every object told a story without emotion. There was no sign of robbery, no forced entry, just two men, one apartment, and a sequence of choices that could never be undone. When they placed Johnson in handcuffs, he didn't resist, he didn't speak. His pulse was steady, his breath even. The officers said later it was like arresting someone who had been waiting for it all day. Outside, the Bronx wind carried the faint hum of traffic, indifferent as ever. Detectives began with what the walls had seen. The neighbors described Collin as quiet, polite, someone who kept to himself. They said he had known Sheldon since childhood, like brothers, one woman said. Both had grown up in Harlem, survived the same streets, served time in the same prison. When Johnson was released after 25 years, it was Collin who helped him find work, who believed in the possibility of change. Now that belief lay dismembered in a freezer. The police traced Johnson's steps backwards. Surveillance from the previous days showed him carrying bags into the building, visiting hardware stores, buying cleaning agents, renting a car. In his Harlem apartment, they found the rest: a head, an arm, and a second bin. The investigation moved with mechanical patience. The gun matched ballistic fragments found near the freezer. Blood spatter patterns told a linear story. 2 shots fired near the kitchen doorway, 2 more closer to the refrigerator. A struggle, a pause, and execution. Detectives pieced together the hours before the murder. Johnson had spent the day online, talking about rehabilitation and social reform. He had built a reputation as a mentor, speaking at schools, even appearing on the Joe Rogan Experience just weeks earlier, describing how he'd left gang life behind. The contradiction became the center of the investigation, the man who preached forgiveness killing the one who helped him start again. In interviews, neighbors remembered the strange smell from the vents. The building superintendent recalled Johnson's composure during questioning. He looked at me like we were talking about the weather. Police later discovered text messages between the 2 men about money, a small debt, never paid, never meant to lead to death. The motive seemed too small for the violence that followed, but crime often hides in ordinary cracks. The autopsy confirmed a single gunshot to the head, fired at close range. The rest, the cutting, the freezing, came later. The case file grew thick with details that no one would ever fully understand. The bleach-stained gloves, the wig fibers, the faint trace of Collin's blood on Johnson's boot. The city moved on. Headlines faded, but the still image remained. 2 men who had escaped prison only to find another one, built from trust, loyalty, and the slow decay of conscience. There are moments when the line between reform and relapse feels like breath on glass. For Sheldon Johnson Jr., it may have disappeared completely. He had spent 25 years behind walls, learning patience, shaping words into philosophy, studying law to understand his own confinement. He became the voice of redemption, telling others that transformation was possible. To the public, he was proof that brutality could turn into purpose. To Collin Small, he was simply the boy from Harlem who needed a couch, a job lead, and a friend who would not remind him of what he had done. But there is a particular kind of exhaustion that follows long imprisonment, the slow corrosion of self-trust. Sheldon's mind had learned structure, waking, eating, counting hours, surviving. Freedom had no rhythm. It was too wide, too uncertain. He tried to build meaning out of the fragments, working as a counselor, a speaker, a mentor for at-risk youth. Yet the city remembered who he had been before he remembered who he was now. Old instincts have gravity. They pull quietly. Detectives later learned that in the weeks before the murder, Sheldon had been struggling financially, a missed rent payment, a denied grant for his non-profit. He had confided to one friend that people didn't really want redemption stories. They wanted entertainment. The facade was cracking. Beneath the polished words and interviews, a violent current still lived patient and unused. When Collin questioned him about money, Perhaps just a small argument, perhaps something larger. It may have struck that dormant nerve. Two men shaped by the same streets, suddenly standing on opposite sides of belief. Psychiatrists who reviewed the case described a man disoriented by success, trapped between guilt and performance. His reformation had become theatre, and in that moment, the masks slipped. What followed wasn't rage, it was method. The same method he had once used to survive, now repurposed for destruction. The cleanup, the precision, the coldness, all signs of someone who had learned to compartmentalize beyond normal capacity. He didn't panic because panic requires surprise. He had seen this version of himself before, in the mirror of his past life, and welcomed it back like an old friend. In the end, the killing was not about Collin, it was about control, the illusion of still owning his narrative when the world had already rewritten it. News broke within hours. Criminal justice reform advocate arrested after body parts found in Bronx apartment. The headlines carried disbelief, as if language itself couldn't reconcile the contrast. The man who had spoken about second chances had taken one away. The media descended on Highbridge. Reporters filled the narrow sidewalks, cameras pointed toward the same rust-colored building where the air still smelled faintly of ammonia. Neighbors stared from windows, murmuring prayers and questions no one could answer. Inside the courthouse, Johnson appeared in a simple gray hoodie, hands cuffed loosely in front of him. His expression was unreadable. He looked neither ashamed nor defiant. When the charges were read, murder, manslaughter, and concealment of a corpse, he blinked slowly, as though adjusting to the sound of his own name. The courtroom was quiet, except for the clicking of reporters' keyboards. Outside, Collin Small's family gathered behind police tape. His sister spoke softly to a microphone. They were like brothers. He helped him get out. He believed in him. Her voice broke on that last word. The investigation became a mirror the city didn't want to hold. It revealed how quickly trust collapses under pressure, how easily the promise of redemption can become its own performance. Prison officers who once worked with Johnson spoke to journalists, their faces half lit by regret. One said, "He fooled us all," or maybe we wanted to be fooled. The apartment remained sealed for months. The superintendent avoided the 6th floor altogether. The smell faded, but something else lingered, the knowledge that evil can exist in silence, dressed in sincerity. When Johnson was transferred to Rikers, he reportedly told a guard, "I was trying to fix what was broken." The guard didn't respond. There was nothing left to fix. Time has a way of washing the color out of memory. The case is now just another file in a metal drawer marked Homicide 2024. But the story doesn't vanish. It mutates, whispered, retold, folded into the city's quiet mythology of broken men. What remains are fragments. A freezer humming in an empty apartment. A friendship that outlasted logic but not survival. Two men who tried to escape the same darkness and collided inside it again. Years from now, when people mention the Bronx torso case, they will remember the irony before the tragedy, the podcast guest, the reformer, the advocate for light. They will speak less about Collin, the man who believed, the man who trusted. The victim's name will fade faster than the perpetrator's, as it often does. In some quiet way, the city itself becomes an accomplice to forgetting. But the apartment still stands. Someone new lives there now, unaware that beneath the fresh coat of paint there are outlines, microscopic traces of blood, absorbed into plaster, sealed under primer, the kind that never truly leaves. If there is a lesson here, it is not about justice. Justice was served in paperwork and sentencing, not in understanding. The real question is quieter. How much of a man's past can ever truly stay buried? For Sheldon Johnson, redemption was not a lie, it was a temporary shelter. And when it collapsed, it took with it the only person who still believed in him. In the end, there are no monsters in this story, only men, and the sound of a freezer door closing for the last time. It began with stillness, the kind that hangs in the air just before sound returns, brittle, waiting. Outside, winter pressed its weight against a small Indiana house. Inside, a 911 operator leaned forward to hear the words that would start the unraveling. The caller's voice was quiet, almost peaceful, but every syllable carried the weight of something irreversible. A 5-year-old boy, unresponsive, barely breathing. No shouting, no panic, only a strange calm, as if the person on the other end already knew that help would be too late. When first responders entered the home, they didn't find chaos, they found order, the cold, rehearsed kind, a living room too clean, toys stacked like evidence of a life that had already been packed away. In the center of that silence lay a small boy named Christian Crossland, his skin pale against the hardwood floor, his ribs showing like fragile lines under thin fabric. He weighed less than 20 pounds. The paramedics moved with professional rhythm, assess, check pulse, begin compressions, but the air in the room had already decided. Nothing there felt alive. The mother stood near the doorway, arms folded as though protecting herself from the cold. She was 30 years old, calm, distant, giving answers that changed each time they were asked. First she said, "He fell." Then she said, "He was sick." Then, almost as an afterthought, she said he had swallowed something, shampoo, maybe. But her voice never cracked, not once. It was the kind of composure that made the silence heavier. The living room gave way to the hallway. Detectives followed the path that felt least human, a door at the end, locked from the outside. Inside that room, they found what was left of Christian's world. A cold floor, a thin sheet, and a plastic bowl with nothing inside. There were faint stains on the walls, irregular shapes where something had hit repeatedly. The temperature was 46 degrees. There was no heat source, just still air and the echo of what had happened over many nights. Neighbors later said they hadn't seen the boy in months. They'd asked sometimes about the laughter that used to drift from the yard, but Chelsea always had an answer. Flu, schooling at home, family visits. None of it true. Christian's absence had become part of the neighborhood's background noise, noticed but not pursued. By the time detectives gathered their first report, the autopsy had already begun. The medical examiner described it clinically. Bruises in various stages of healing, fractures old and new, deep tissue injuries consistent with prolonged abuse. There was no recent accident. This was starvation, dehydration, blunt force trauma. His organs had begun to shut down long before that morning. He had been dying for weeks, quietly behind a closed door that no one opened. At the station, Chelsea Crossland gave statements that spiraled in on themselves. She said he'd been difficult, that she was stressed, that she'd meant to discipline, not destroy. Her words were soft, precise, like someone reading from a manual written for sympathy. But in the interview room, detectives didn't look for remorse, they looked for patterns. And there they found them. Text messages retrieved from her phone painted the edges of the story. Short, functional notes to family about needing space from the kids. A search history filled with terms that blurred between cruelty and justification. Child won't eat. Discipline without marks. How long can a kid go without food? Every search was a quiet confession. In her bedroom, the one Christian had been confined to, they found a belt folded neatly on a dresser, a wooden board, stained at one end. A journal where she wrote prayers that began with guilt and ended in anger. Each entry seemed to argue with itself, part apology, part declaration of control. When the detectives left the house that night, the frost had thickened across the car hoods outside. Breath lingered in the air longer than words could. One of them wrote in his notebook, "No toys, no bed, no chance." That was the summary, not for the report, but for the truth they couldn't say aloud. The trial that followed was less about evidence and more about endurance. Every witness spoke in fragments. A neighbor who'd heard crying through thin walls. A social worker who'd visited once months earlier and found nothing unusual. A paramedic who admitted he still saw the boy's face when he closed his eyes. Each testimony added weight to a silence that seemed endless. Prosecutors built their case around time, not the moment of death, but the slow, deliberate erosion that led there. They showed the photographs one by one, not to shock, but to measure duration. The bruises healing beside new ones, the starvation charted by calendar. The courtroom stayed still. Even the hum of the fluorescent lights felt intrusive. Chelsea's defense tried to paint her as overwhelmed, unwell, adrift in mental collapse, but the medical reports stripped away the narrative. Starvation required planning. Neglect required time. The evidence showed decisions, not impulses. When the verdict came, guilty of murder, the judge spoke in a tone as level as the winter horizon. He said it was a crime that defied the language of mercy, that no sentence could restore what was lost, but one could ensure it would never happen again. Life without parole, no release, no reduction, no revision. And yet that conclusion, the dissent continued, not hers, but the world around the case. Reporters moved on. Headlines shifted. The community, for a time, spoke about justice, about protection, about the system that fails before it intervenes. Then, gradually, the conversation dissolved into routine. The same streets stayed quiet. The same houses kept their curtains drawn. But for those who had stood in that small room, paramedics, detectives, jurors, the silence never left. They carried fragments, the image of bones too sharp beneath skin, the weight of air that refused to move, the stillness of a child who never fought back because he no longer could. Chelsea's appeal reached the Indiana Supreme Court in early 2025. Her lawyers argued for leniency, for reconsideration. The court responded in a single, deliberate paragraph. The cruelty was extraordinary, the evidence overwhelming, the punishment warranted. With that, the last door closed. In a procedural sense, the story ended there. But time doesn't file paperwork. It lingers in the places where the evidence was first gathered, in the chill of that bedroom, the echo of footsteps down a hallway, the sound of an operator repeating an address she would never forget. That's where Christian's story remains, not as a case number, not as testimony, but as a room where light never returns the same way twice. When the sentence was handed down, the courtroom didn't move. No gasps, no tears, just the sound of pens scratching the date into court records. April 2025. Life without parole. 3 words that filled the room like static. Chelsea Crossland was led away without turning back. Her steps were steady, measured, almost deliberate. There was nothing in her posture that resembled regret. Some people said she had run out of emotion long before the trial began. Others thought she had simply learned to exist without it. Outside the courthouse, reporters spoke into cold microphones. Words like justice and closure floated through the air, but no one really seemed to believe them. Behind them, the grey sky folded into itself, the kind of weather that doesn't change, just lingers. People drove home in silence, and somewhere, in a quiet cemetery, a small headstone had already been placed. Christian Lee Crossland, 2017-2022. The engraving was simple. Beneath it, someone had left a single blue toy car. It had started to rust. For investigators, the case ended on paper, but cases like this don't end, they echo. One detective, the first to walk through the Crossland home, requested a transfer 6 months later. He said the silence in that house had followed him home. He'd wake in the night and think he heard a child breathing through the walls. The paramedic retired early. He said he had stopped trusting the calm calls, the ones that sounded too composed. He told a colleague, "The quiet ones are the worst. They've already decided the outcome before we arrive." In Jay County, people began locking their doors at night, though no one could say why. It wasn't fear of danger, it was fear of blindness, the realization that a horror had lived among them and no one had noticed until it was too late. Neighbors replayed every small detail they could remember: the drawn curtains, the absence of laughter, the weeks when the trash never went out. Every sign had been there, just ordinary enough to ignore. The prosecutor declined further interviews. She said the photographs had changed her, that she could no longer eat dinner without seeing bruises where color didn't belong. When asked if she felt justice had been done, she paused for a long time. Finally, she said, "Justice doesn't undo anything. It just prevents a repetition." Then she ended the interview. Chelsea's appeal was filed automatically, as the law requires. Her lawyers built it around mental strain, depression, claims of diminished capacity. They argued that years of isolation and poverty had warped her judgment, that she was a product of circumstance. But the Indiana Supreme Court found no complexity to save her. In their written opinion, they used words rarely seen together in legal text: calculated, sustained, and merciless. They wrote that her actions displayed a conscious pattern of domination, not desperation. The conviction stood, the sentence remained absolute. No parole, no reconsideration, no further appeal. The file was closed, but not forgotten. In the archives of the county courthouse, Christian's name sits between hundreds of others. Each page has a barcode, a date, and a seal, but no warmth. That's how memory survives in systems: catalogued, not felt. When clerks pass the file to new interns, they whisper that it's the one that broke people. They never say why. The pages explain it without words. The house where it happened stands empty now. Its paint has peeled into thin curls, the yard overgrown. Every spring, children pass it by on their way to school, glancing only once before looking away. Their parents tell them it's just another abandoned house, but no one forgets which one it was. Even the air around it seems heavier. The window blinds still hang crooked, as if something inside once strained to look out. The realtor's sign has faded to white. No one ever calls the number. For a time, social services used the case in training seminars: slides, bullet points, procedural lessons. Indicators of prolonged neglect, one slide reads. Patterns of isolation, another. It's meant to educate, to prevent, to remind. But no slide captures what the paramedic saw when he carried the boy out that morning. No bullet point can teach the sound of a heartbeat that decides to stop. The community held a vigil that first winter after the trial. Candles lined the courthouse steps. Each one flickered unevenly in the wind, small lights against a black sky. The minister who spoke didn't use the word forgiveness. He said the word remembrance instead. He said that to remember is to bear witness, not to fix, not to heal, but to ensure silence never wins. When the vigil ended, people left their candles in a circle, their wax pooling together as they melted. By morning, they had solidified into a single pale ring on the concrete, something that looked almost deliberate. There is a peculiar quiet that follows crimes like this. Not the peace of resolution, but the absence of sound after something unspeakable. The courts move on, the journalists file new stories, but the silence stays. It seeps into routine, into grocery aisles and parking lots, into the pauses of everyday conversation. People remember, not through discussion, but through avoidance. In Jay County, no one says the Crossland name anymore. The address exists, but it's spoken of as geography, not history. What endures are the questions that never find answers. What makes a person cross the line between discipline and destruction? How does love rot into control so complete that it kills what it was meant to protect? No psychology report, no sentencing memo can contain that unraveling. The truth sits somewhere smaller, in seconds of choice, in moments when mercy was an option and wasn't taken. At the Indiana Women's Prison, Chelsea lives in routine. Lights on at 6, count at 8, silence after 9. She works in the laundry wing, folding sheets, pressing uniforms. Guards say she rarely speaks. Her cell walls are bare, except for a small calendar and a state-issued Bible. When she writes letters, they're returned unopened. No one left to send them to. Her family stopped visiting after the verdict. Inmates call her the quiet one, not out of respect, but out of something closer to discomfort. Even among those who've done harm, her calm is unsettling. There are no anniversaries for crimes like hers, no remembrance days, no condolences posted online, only the steady passing of time. Each day identical to the last, each meal a repetition of consequence. It is the kind of life that mirrors what she gave her son: confinement, silence, absence of warmth. Justice in its purest form sometimes becomes imitation. A year after the sentencing, a reporter revisited the case for a feature on child welfare reforms. She drove to the site of the house, parked in the same gravel driveway where the ambulance once stood, and listened. The wind moved through the trees like a low hum. She said it felt like the house was breathing. She stood there for a long time, notebook in hand, but wrote only one sentence before leaving. There is no sound more haunting than the silence left by a child who was never heard. In the records, Christian's life is measured in pages: birth certificate, medical reports, death certificate. 3 documents to contain 5 years. But those who remember him refuse to let that be the whole story. His kindergarten teacher keeps a drawing he made, a blue sun with too many rays. She said he was the only child who drew the sun smiling inward instead of outward. It hangs in a frame beside her desk, its crayon lines fading. When new students ask about it, she just says it's from someone who loved the color blue. Time doesn't repair stories like this. It files them down until they almost stop hurting. But almost is not silence. Every now and then, someone brings flowers to that small headstone. Sometimes it's a neighbor. Sometimes it's a stranger. No one stays long. They place the flowers, straighten the toy car, and leave. The air there is always colder, than the rest of the cemetery, as if the ground itself remembers. Justice, in the legal sense, was done, but justice has no warmth. It closes doors, files paperwork, locks cells. It does not hold the child who should have been held. It does not erase the nights of hunger or the small voice that asked for water. It simply balances the scale, metal against metal, law against loss. And in that balance, something human always disappears. The story of Christian Crossland remains not because of its violence, but because of its quietness. It asks us nothing except to remember that cruelty often hides in plain sight, behind normal walls, under normal roofs, spoken in calm voices that never raise an alarm. His story is not a lesson, not a warning, not even a closure. It is a mirror. When you look at it long enough, it doesn't show monsters. It shows moments, missed calls, ignored instincts, the faint sound of laughter that stopped too soon. And under all of it, one unchanging truth. The smallest lives are the easiest to break and the hardest to forget.